Thank you so much, Sharon. And it's lovely to be with you guys. Thank you for having me. I know that you had an opportunity last time, I gather, to think of a question, maybe a question that somebody who's not yet a believer in Jesus might ask. And so Tim very kindly grouped them together. And you may or may not be surprised to know that the number one question was related to this huge issue. How could a good God allow so much suffering? So if that really is the most likely question that be asked by someone who doesn't know Jesus yet, I think it's a good idea to talk about it. It's actually a relatively hard thing to talk about because you've been touched by suffering. I've been touched by suffering, but hey, it's real, isn't it? So why don't we get into it and let's talk about this for a short while. I've been encouraged to tackle a couple of subjects by speaking about them, and then, as you can imagine, I'm going to throw it open for you to ask questions, and you might want to ask questions about other subjects. It's not as if there's only two things that we ever get asked about. Is that okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. So let me make some preliminary comments about talking to somebody about this very difficult question. First one is that in the Bible, as you may know, in 1 Peter 3 verse 15, we are encouraged in the Bible to have an answer for those who ask us and to present our faith and defend our faith. And we're told in that verse to do it with gentleness and respect. And I'm sure that's something that you would do anyway, but I thought it's important to mention that. Second thing I'd say is that there is probably something that has happened to this person that's made them ask the question. Wouldn't you agree? And so I would encourage you, as the Bible says, to mourn with those who mourn, to find out what that thing is that happened to them or their family, and then to connect with them and to empathize with them. However, it is actually a question that people actually do want an answer to. And let me say this. I didn't grow up in a Bible-believing evangelical Christian home. I didn't go to church. I didn't have any friends who did. And I used to ask this question. This was one of my objections to Christianity. And I think that from my point of view, before I was a Christian, I would have said that if I were God, I might have said, if I were God, then I would want to maximize human happiness in this life. Wouldn't that be a loving thing for God to do? Now that I'm a Christian, I have come to understand that that isn't actually God's goal. God's goal is not to maximize human happiness in this life. What God wants to do, I think, is he wants to maximize the circumstances in which the greatest number of people would freely choose him. Because from God's point of view, the goal of human existence is not happiness in this life. From God's point of view, the goal of human existence is to know God. So I'm now going to go into about 20 minutes worth of stuff that I might say, and then we'll come up for air and we'll talk to each other. Is that okay? You ready? Here we go. So this is a picture of my mum. I don't know about you, but I would quite like to have my life with all the good bits still in it, but with all the suffering taken out. Let me see if I can explain what I mean. Imagine if I said to you that on my parents' first ever date, the first time that my mum and my dad ever went out, they stood on a bridge over the River Thames in London. And my dad says, "Oh, what's that ring you've got on there?" My mum says, "Oh, what, this? Oh, nothing. My old boyfriend, previous boyfriend, he gave me this ring. It doesn't really mean anything to me. I just wear it because, I quite like the look of it." "Oh, let's see," my dad says. So my mum takes off the ring, she hands it to my dad, but without even looking at the ring, my dad chucks it off the bridge into the River Thames. It sinks to the bottom, never to be seen again. My mother responds to this by laughing. She thinks it's funny. she feels he's kind of been assertive and romantic and even a bit brave, kind of, I'm the man for you, you're finished with him type thing. She responds positively, but I'm sure you would agree with me that it was equally likely that she could have responded negatively. She could have thought, well, what an arrogant so-and-so. I just told you that I liked that ring. It might, for all you know, be worth some money. You've thrown it into the river without even asking me. This is our first date. You know what? Maybe I won't give you a second date. She might have thought. Maybe, she might have thought, I might just go back to that previous boyfriend. Now let's imagine that I ask my mother when I hear about this. Oh, just by the way, I say to my mum, who was the previous boyfriend? Just out of interest. She says, well, actually, he became a millionaire, a multi-millionaire. In fact, he actually became a billionaire, she says. But the thing is, he gave all his money to his son. I then think to myself, oh wow. If you had gone back to the previous boyfriend, then as your son, I would have inherited his fortune. I would have been a multi-millionaire. In fact, I would have been a billionaire. And if I had been a billionaire, that would have removed at least some, possibly quite a lot, of the suffering from my life. But hang on a minute. I've just made a mistake, haven't I? Because that person, that son, born of a union of Angela Burton and the multimillionaire, that person is not Adrian Holloway. He's not me. In the world I've just imagined myself out of existence. In the world with less suffering, I don't exist. I'm never born. Now, what if there really is a God who really loves you and wanted you in particular to come into existence? Therefore, God creates the world in which you in particular exist. What if that world, without suffering, is actually a world that you don't exist in, and that I don't exist in? In the summer of 2016, our second eldest daughter, Bethany, went on a holiday to the south of France with her best friend from school, Natasha Edna Laperouse. At Heathrow Airport, Tashi bought a sandwich from Pret a Manger, and on the plane, Tashi had an allergic reaction to the sesame seeds in the sandwich. Tashi knew that she was allergic to sesame seeds, but Pret hadn't labelled the sandwich to say that it had allergens in it, and sadly Tashi died on that British Airways flight. So Tanya and Nad lost their daughter, and Bethany, my daughter, had the trauma of watching her best friend die in the seat next to her on the flight. And just for my interest, how many of you, just put a hand up if you've heard something about this story in the news? Oh, wow, well, everybody. Okay, so you already know this story. I'd love to tell you the very, very end of the story in just a few minutes' time, in terms of what happened next, because maybe you've seen Tanya and Ned on the news. They're very close friends of ours. Suffice to say that before I became a Christian, suffering was probably my biggest objection to Christianity. As I mentioned, I didn't go to church. I didn't actually know anyone. I didn't actually know anyone who went to church. Still today, I think, especially since Tasha's tragic death, I have been asking this question. In a nutshell, I think our question is something like this. Surely, if God is all good, he would want to prevent suffering. And if he's all powerful, then he would be able to stop suffering. So, seeing as suffering exists, how can an all-powerful, all-loving God exist? So I'd like to look at 4 perspectives on suffering. The first of those is free will. Why does God allow suffering? It's important to notice that this question presupposes that God exists. Now, I don't know, what do we think that this God should do? Perhaps we think he should have gone for option A. Perhaps we think he should have gone for option B and created robots who don't have free will. What God does is he creates free moral agents, just like him, who can make real choices. He goes for option C, a high-risk option. So we've got to ask, what is to be gained by having free will? God's answer to this question is genuine love. Now, there is a direct link between free will and love. I discovered this for myself in the summer of 1995 when I fell in love with a marine biologist called Julia Brown. The whole thrill of it was that she chose to love me back. She could easily have chosen not to. She could easily have chosen somebody else, but she didn't. She chose me. That's why it was exciting. Robots can't fall in love. If God is powerful enough to stop suffering and then chooses not to, presumably there must be a reason. There must be presumably some reason why, in his opinion at least, it is worth allowing suffering. Well, what if God wants there to be real love, genuine choice in the world? And because he wants real love, that means he wants to give us freedom of choice. But of course, he runs the risk that people might rebel against him because they're free to do so, and they might even rebel against each other because they're free to do so, and that will create suffering in the world. What is even harder to talk about are natural disasters. An event, for example, like the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in Southeast Asia, because here an earthquake was to blame. Now, I don't think I'll say anything about what I'm about to say to someone who actually suffered the effects of an earthquake. But if you or I had to write a report about why the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami happened, we would write that it happened because our planet is made up of absolutely enormous tectonic plates that grate against each other. But if it were not for the existence of plate tectonics, you and I wouldn't be here. We would still have a water world. Without plate tectonics, the continents would never have formed. Inside the Earth, in its core, there is a lot of hot, molten metal. And as it rotates, that makes the Earth magnetic. The Earth's magnetism creates the Earth's atmosphere. Both of those things have to be exactly as they currently are in order for there to be any human life on the surface of our planet. On the other hand, all the heat that is in the Earth's core would make our planet explode unless there's a release mechanism. Earthquakes are that release mechanism. The hot magnetic metal in our planet's core generates the atmosphere without the protection of our radiation shield, which is sustained by the movement in the Earth's molten core. Without that protective shield, the solar winds would kill everyone on Earth, but there would be no radiation shields without earthquakes. But look, there is no getting away from it. There's no escape from it. Natural disasters are appalling. They leave us crying out, why? And anybody who isn't deeply moved by the scenes on our TV screens must have a heart of stone. A second perspective on suffering is that God sometimes works through suffering to bring about good. Now, for some reason, people think that the Bible promises that in this life, it will all be lovely. Actually, the Bible doesn't say that. In fact, Jesus went around saying things like, you're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars and all sorts of terrible things are going to happen, so the Bible nowhere says that in this life it will all be wonderful. Let's move to a third perspective, which is that God is not immune from suffering, that he suffered too. I wouldn't want anybody here to get the impression that Christians are trying to get God off the hook for suffering, because God put himself on the hook. God put himself on the cross. Have you ever heard the poem, The Long Silence? It goes like this. At the end of time, billions of people were scattered on a great plain before God's throne. Most shrank back from the brilliant light before them, but some groups near the front talked heatedly, not with cringing shame, but with belligerence. Can God judge us? How can he know about suffering? Snapped a young girl. She ripped open her sleeve to reveal a tattooed number from a Nazi concentration camp. We endured terror, beatings, torture and death, she said. In another group, a young man lowered his collar. What about this? He demanded, showing an ugly rope burn. Lynched for no crime but being black. In another crowd, a pregnant schoolgirl with sullen eyes. Why should I suffer? She murmured. It wasn't my fault. Far out across the plain, there were hundreds of such groups. Each had a complaint against God for the evil and suffering that he had permitted in his world. How lucky God was to live in heaven, where all was sweetness and light, where there was no weeping or fear or hunger or hatred. What did God know of all that humanity had been forced to endure in the world? For God leads a pretty sheltered life, they said. So each of these groups sent forth their leader, chosen because he or she had suffered most. A Jew, someone from Hiroshima, a horribly deformed arthritic, a thalidomide child. In the center of the plain, they consulted with each other, and at last they were ready to present their case. Before God could be qualified to be their judge, he must endure what they had endured. Their decision was that God should be sentenced to live on earth as a man. Let him be born a Jew, they said. Let the legitimacy of his birth be doubted. Give him a work so difficult to do that even his family will think he's out of his mind when he tries to do it. Let him be betrayed by his closest friends. Let him face false charges. Let him be tried by a prejudiced jury, and let him be convicted by a cowardly judge. Let him be tortured, flogged, scourged with a whip, mocked, spat at, then let him be totally alone, deserted, and then in extreme agony, let him die, they said. As each leader announced his portion of the sentence, loud murmurs of approval went up from the throng of people assembled. And then when the last had finished pronouncing sentence, there was a long silence. No one uttered another word. No one moved. For suddenly, all knew that God had already served his sentence. The Christian answer to suffering is a person. It's not an answer as such, it's a person. Hey, if I am suffering, if I have a personal problem, I need a personal answer. As it happens, God is a someone and not a something. In that sense, when we think of the worst moments of our lives, Jesus has been there. Are you broken? Jesus was broken on the cross. Are you rejected by your friends? Jesus was rejected by his friends. Are you hated for no good reason? Jesus was hated for no good reason. And when we cry out, and when we complain, I can't take it anymore, we can think of Jesus suffering on the cross, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is more than an explanation. Jesus is a person. And of course, if, as I drive home tonight, I get a phone call from the police informing me that my wife and 4 kids have all died in a car crash. I don't know if I will ever find in this life an adequate explanation for what happened, but I do believe that God has left me with something more satisfying than an explanation. God has left me with a person called Jesus. Maybe you're here this evening, and when all is said and done, something evil has happened to you. I know that nothing that's been said or will be said this evening is going to take away the pain. It's also true that something evil happened on a hill outside Jerusalem in around 33 AD when an innocent man was murdered. But God brought something brilliant out of that tragedy. God allowed the suffering of his own son because he knew that through it something wonderful would be achieved. At the time, Jesus' disciples thought it was a disaster. Their hero had been executed, all their hopes and dreams were in tatters. They had no idea that through Jesus dying on the cross, Jesus was actually solving the biggest problem they had, the problem of sin. Can you imagine millions of years of ecstasy? Can you imagine living in a place where every day is better than the one before? Anyway, those are 4 perspectives on suffering, and at the end of this little talk, somebody says, Adrian, thanks, but it's just not good enough. As it happens, I agree. But it seems to me that at the cross of Christ, on that day, at least, we can see how a God of love could allow suffering. Because on that day, let's just revisit our 4 points. Firstly, on that day, we see the results of human freedom. It was human decisions that put Jesus on the cross. There was a small group of men who deliberately denied Jesus a fair trial. Pontius Pilate had Jesus flogged and crucified. So we see the results of human freedom in that evil decision. Secondly, we see God working through suffering. When Jesus was dying, God seemed to have deserted Jesus. But actually, everything that happened to Jesus on that day had been planned by God centuries before. In the Old Testament, which was finished 400 years before Jesus was even born, we have these documents that predict details of that day. Psalm 41:9 says the Messiah would be betrayed by a friend, in this case Judas. Isaiah 50 verse 6 says the Messiah will be struck and spat upon. It's also predicted the price that Judas would receive to betray Jesus, the 30 pieces of silver, Zechariah 11:12. The next verse in Zechariah rightly predicts that that money would be used to buy a potter's field. Psalm 22:18 is predicted that at the foot of the cross, the soldiers would cast lots for his clothing, and so on. So my point is the suffering was real. My point is the injustice was real, but it was all planned. Jesus fulfilled 29 prophecies on the day that he died. So clearly, on that day at least, God was working through suffering. Thirdly, on the cross, we see that God is not immune from suffering. He suffered too. And as I close, I think this is the most helpful point of all. If Christianity is true, then the God who really exists can relate to what I'm going through. Christians worship a God who saw the drama of human suffering and decided to dive in and suffer too. And fourthly, on the cross, we see that God more than compensates for our suffering. Could it be that one day from heaven, you will look back on your earthly life and you will say, do you know what? After 75 billion years in heaven, I think it was worth it. After all, could it be that one day from heaven you will look back through all the tears, through all the emotional pain, through the physical pain? Could it be that from heaven you will say, God has more than compensated for my suffering? So in conclusion, we don't have a God who just folds his arms and looks down impassively from heaven at human suffering. No, we have a God who saw how bad it was and dived in and suffered with us. We have a suffering God. We have a crucified God. Just before I finish, I did promise you, didn't I, that I would tell you more about Alex, Tanya, and Nad, Ednan Laperouse. If you just want to put this next slide up. 2 years before Tashi died, through her friendship with our daughter Bethany, Tashi had put her trust in Jesus Christ. A few months after Tashi died on the plane, her brother Alex, who's on the left of the picture, he put his trust in Jesus Christ. Next, Tashi's mum Tanya, she put her trust in Jesus Christ. And then, as you can see here, Tashi's dad, Nat, Nadeem, put his trust in Christ. So all three of them have become Christians, and we baptized all three of them. If Tanya, Nad, and Alex were here on the stage talking to you now, they would say that God so loved them that he allowed the suffering of his one and only son Jesus so that Tanya, Nad, Alex, and Tashi might all have eternal life. So thank you very much for bearing with me over the last 20 minutes. I'll just come up for air now and invite a couple of questions, and we'll move on. So a couple of questions from anybody. Anybody want to ask anything?
I was talking to a friend of mine about the tectonic plates, exactly that conversation this week. I think she was a Christian, or said she was a Christian, but has had some bad experiences and has now completely against it and has gone down the science route. And I mean, I don't know very much about them, but what I said, she was talking about the gonzo, was it the big massive Earth before?
Yep.
And I didn't know. I made a guess. I mean, were the tectonic plates necessarily always there, or could they have caused that split, or was that part of the fall? I suppose you won't know that, will you? I mean, who knows?
It's a very good question, and it's interesting that as you were asking your question, you brought up what we're going to go on and talk about, because it seems that your friend was saying that there's some kind of trade-off, either science or Christianity, and we're going to move on, and I'm hopefully going to present a case for saying it's not an either-or. In fact, exactly the opposite is the case. So, yes, there was this land mass before the continents formed, but there was no human life at that time. So I imagine if your friend enjoys her life, what she's looking for is a world in which she would have existed. And put it this way, scientists predict that if we do find life on other planets, they predict that those planets will have plate tectonics. So at the moment, they can't imagine a world whereby you would have the right conditions for advanced organic life on the surface of a planet, unless you've got all those things in place. Some sort of defense mechanism, radiation shield, right amount of gravity, radiation field generated by magnetic movement of the molten core. So there's quite a few moving parts that make advanced organic life extremely unlikely anywhere in the universe. So that's a great question. One more from anyone? Okay, well, if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the science bits I was planning to do. And then, at that point, as I draw to a close, I have no other stuff prepared. I'm expecting you guys to ask any questions. You can ask anything. Don't worry, I've done this many times with sometimes quite hostile audiences, so you can say literally anything, and I promise you I will not be fazed in any way, shape or form. But if you do have a question about anything, remember, we are thinking about what would someone who's not a Christian ask. So if it's a question about, I don't know, the policy and practice of New Life Church or trustee's position on this area, that's probably not what we're talking about tonight. It will be, what would someone who's not a believer, what would they ask? And so those kind of questions. But have a think about that, and let's talk for a little bit. I mean, this will only be, guys, maybe 10 minutes. We'll talk about science, and then we'll open it up. Okay. Let's say something briefly about the origin of the universe. Remember, the whole question here is it science or God? Do we have to choose? Like, I'm a scientist, therefore obviously I don't believe in God. Or is it the opposite? Up until the late 1920s, atheists used to argue that the universe was eternal. Just accept it, they said, it's always been there. And they used to argue in that way because at that time, this is in the 1920s, early 1920s, up until then, the universe was thought to be locked in a static or steady state. But then an American astronomer called Edwin Hubble took a series of photos in 1929 that proved that the universe is definitely not locked in a static, steady state. Hubble saw that the other galaxies are actually moving away from us and from each other. Now, I've got here in my back pocket some failed universes. These are balloons that have stars in them, or on them. And as these balloons blew up, if they had successfully inflated, then the stars would have moved apart from each other. What Edwin Hubble saw through his telescope was the stars moving away from each other as the balloon inflates. The galaxies are moving apart from each other. But that was surprising because it's much more likely that the universe wouldn't be like that, and much more likely it would be like this, it would have failed to get off the ground. If all the galaxies are moving away from each other, the conclusion is obvious that the universe is expanding. Cosmologists concluded that seeing as the universe is expanding, in the past it must have been smaller than it is today, and they concluded that at some point in the past, it must have had a beginning. Then, in 1965, astronomers Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias discovered some background radiation in the universe. It was an actual noise. That noise was left behind by that beginning moment. That radiation is like a signature left behind by the beginning moment. So today, there is an overwhelming scientific consensus that at one time the universe did have a beginning. So this is what science is saying. Let me put it to you another way. Imagine I said to you, 13.7 billion years ago, there was absolutely nothing. Then, 1 second later, there was a huge purple carrot the size of Milton Keynes. Now, the sudden appearance of the huge purple carrot would demand some sort of explanation. You see, it's not that matter and energy exploded into an already existing space-time universe. No, space and time themselves began to exist at this beginning moment. Space, time, matter, and energy all began to exist at this beginning moment. We now know that the universe came into existence suddenly out of nothing. And this discovery supports the second step of a simple case for the existence of God. Step 1 says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, this sounds reasonable. We don't know of any exceptions to step 1. Step 2 says that the universe began to exist, and as we've just seen, that, it just so happens, is the reigning scientific orthodoxy today. That is the standard model. So the conclusion necessarily follows that the universe has a cause. Something or someone that exists outside of time and space caused the universe to come into being. We are talking about cause and effect. To get a universe out of nothing, you need a cause. A cause capable of bringing space, time, matter, and energy into existence. And you could call that sort of cause God. So, we spoke then about the origin of the universe. Let's speak briefly now about the so-called fine-tuning of the universe. Now, we know that if we were 5% closer to the sun, we'd fry. We know that if we were 5% further away, we'd freeze. There wouldn't be any life on Earth. We know that our solar system just happens to be in what astronomers call the Goldilocks zone of the Milky Way, in between the Sagittarius and Perseus spiral arms. You might be able to see on the next slide tiny yellow letters that show where our sun is. This is a rare, safe place in the Milky Way, also where you are. But the degree of fine-tuning that we are talking about with the origin of the universe is far more impressive than any of that. Way back at the beginning of the universe, there's an explosion that causes matter to fly outwards, but this matter flies outwards at a perfectly controlled speed. Too fast, and nothing will ever settle down and exist in the universe. That's the burst balloons you saw earlier. Too slow an expansion, and rats. The universe just collapses back on itself and never gets going in the first place. So the universe expands, but the speed of expansion turns out to be critical. If slowed down too much, the universe collapses. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the beginning moment had been smaller by even 1 part in 100 million billion 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 billion, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size. Now, the speed of the expansion is crucial, yeah? The speed of the expansion is controlled by the cosmological constant. That is the energy density of empty space. My point being that that cosmological constant cannot be just any old number. No. In order for life to exist, the value of the cosmological constant has to be fine-tuned to a very precise number. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. But it's not just the cosmological constant, which I realise you might be able to see this, but that's 4 up from the bottom. There are 20 of these forces. There are 20 numbers, 20 values that have to be just so, otherwise no people, no humans could ever have existed. Roger Penrose, who developed our current understanding of black holes, he computed the odds, the chances of entropy. Entropy, we're talking about the speed at which things break down and decay into disorder. The chances of entropy having the value that it actually had, the chances of it being like it is, here's the chance, 1 chance in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. Now that is a number that has more zeros on the end of it than the total number of particles in the entire universe. However, entropy is only one of these 20 factors. All 20 have to be just so for us to be here. So, why is our universe so very unlikely? Answer, because of the number of competing forces that have to be perfectly balanced in the earliest seconds of the universe's existence. So, it turns out that gravity and electromagnetism have to just exist, but not just exist. They have to be finely tuned to each other. The same is true of matter and antimatter. The same is true of neutrons and electrons. The same is true of the strong and the weak nuclear force. And the list goes on. Any messing with any of the numbers, if you touch any of these dials, no universe, no us, we wouldn't be here. Let me give you one visual illustration. I've got here a tape measure. Imagine if this tape measure was enormously long. So long that it actually stretched from one side of the observable universe all the way to the other side of the universe. A very, very long tape measure, yeah? If that were the case, that actually would be a representation of the possible range of force strengths that gravity could have had. Okay? Now, let's imagine that gravity is actually set here on the tape measure. Remember how long the tape measure is. Now let's imagine that I want to increase the strength of gravity by only 2.5 centimeters from here to here on this vast scale. That tiny increase from here to here, scientists have shown, would increase the strength of gravity on Earth a billionfold. This tiny increase from here to here would have meant that there was no human life on Earth. This tiny increase from here to here would have meant that planet Earth would have had a maximum diameter of just 12 meters. In other words, planet Earth would never have been any bigger than this stage. That tiny change. All of these numbers on the table that we're looking at have to be perfectly related to each other. Scientists have found that there's two numbers, two on our list of 20, that are fine-tuned to each other to a precision of 1 part in 10 to the power 40. Now, it's very hard to imagine these huge numbers, but Professor Hugh Ross at Toronto University has a famous illustration, a funny illustration of the 1 in 10 to the power 40 chance. So let's take this coin. Dr. Hugh Ross says, imagine a continent the size of North America. Imagine you cover the whole continent with coins that look like this. And then you pile your coins up 236,000 miles so that they reach to the height of the moon. Then do that an additional 1 billion continents. So in total you've got 1 million continents, the size of North America, all the size of North America, all covered in coins that look like this, all of which reach 236,000 miles into the sky. And we're talking about a vast number of coins, I'm sure you'd agree. Remember, we're trying to establish what a 1 in 10 to the power 40 chance is. He says, then, invite a member of the public to participate in a scientific experiment. And if they say yes, you blindfold them. And then when they're blindfolded, you hide your one specific coin somewhere in one of the 1 billion piles, all of which are all the size of North America, all of which all reach 236,000 miles into the sky. And then you say to your blindfolded friend, pick a coin, any coin. The chance that your friend will pick out this coin from one of the 1 billion piles that are the size of North America that reach 236,000 miles into the sky, the chance they'll pick out this particular coin is a 1 in 10 to the power 40 chance. So that gives you an idea of the numbers. That's what we need for just 2 of our list of 20 to be fine-tuned in the way that they are. But in order for you to be breathing, for you to exist, all 20 have to be just so. Folks, I reached the point where I realized that in any other area of my life, I would never accept sheer luck or chance as the best explanation for the facts that are in front of us. Okay, let's do one more thing. We'll watch a short video. We're watching this because it's all to do with the origin of the genetic code of life, but also because this happens to be my favorite video. It's a bit bizarre, perhaps. So there is audio on this. It's only 2 minutes long. We're going into a human cell, and we're going to look at this huge question: where did the DNA code of life come from? So if you want to play the video, this is about 2 minutes long.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the Earth.
Okay. So, just to recap, we're coming to the end here. The key question is, where did that DNA code come from in the first place, in the first ever living cell? DNA is an information code. It can be written down in letters. It is an intelligent message. It does exist inside the cell. It has to exist for the cell to work and reproduce itself, which begs this question, where did the information code come from in the first ever living cell? The information is written in the code, so the code and the means of translating it have to both come online at the same time. This is a massive problem for any chance theory. So, I'm sure you've realized that nothing that I've said there proves that God exists. Draw together the threads. Whether you look at the origin of the universe, or whether you're looking at the fine-tuning of the universe, or whether you're looking at the origin of biological information, in all three cases, it does seem as if you need a transcendent, intelligent first cause, and you could call a transcendent, intelligent first cause God. So it seems that actually science hasn't buried God. It seems that God's existence is a viable, reasonable explanation for the existence of the universe, for the fine-tuning of the universe, and for the existence of organic life. Thank you very much. That's it. Okay, well, thank you for your patience, and I hope that you found something interesting in all of that. I want to encourage you, yes, you can ask a question either about suffering or about science, but actually this is the bit where you could ask a question about anything, and then don't worry, because at some point, Sharon will come up and she'll say, that's it, we're done, so it won't go on forever. But I'd love you to ask any questions you might have. If you want to raise your hand. Yes, gentleman to my right.
In a second, I'm afraid. So,
just in a nutshell, if someone, the original question about if there is a God, etc., how would you tell somebody in a nutshell, like 2 or 3 sentences, about the suffering part?
About what, sorry?
suffering.
If I only had 2 or 3 minutes,
Yeah.
2 or 3 sentences, I'm sorry. If I only had 2 or 3 sentences and I had to say something about suffering, I'd probably say, I think I would say, if I only had 2 or 3 sentences and someone was asking me about suffering, I would go and talk about the fact that as Christians, I believe that God was suffering on the cross. So I'd make that point that I made towards the end. I dare say you are suffering. Maybe I am suffering. But at least in the Bible, we don't have a God who folds his arms and passively just looks on at human suffering, but we actually have a God, if Christianity is true, who died and suffered with us. So God can at least relate to suffering. So I think I'd first of all make that point. Remember, the only way you can ask that question is if you presuppose that God exists. And if God does exist, if God doesn't exist, then suffering is not a problem. On atheism, we don't have a problem with suffering. On atheism, stuff happens, it's not even a thing. On atheism, there's no source of absolute morality, there's no good or evil, it's just something that happens. But if God exists, suffering is a problem, and if God exists, then we actually have in Christianity a God who chose to suffer. So God can at least relate to what you're going through. I think that was, if I only had like 3 sentences, I'd talk about that. Yes? Oh, we got one. I'll leave you to do the microphone till I'll stop directing. You can ask a question about anything, it doesn't have to be about what I've said.
Okay, the question is about dinosaurs.
Yes.
Did God create dinosaurs? Presumably he did. What was the purpose? And why aren't they mentioned in the Bible?
Okay. So the question, if you didn't hear it, is about dinosaurs. Did God create dinosaurs? If he did, why aren't they mentioned in the Bible? So, my answer to this question will reveal the fact that I happen to think that the earth is old, that I don't happen to take the view that the Bible constrains us to believe in a young earth. And I completely accept the fact that there will be people in this room who disagree with me about that. So I shall just do a little bit of work. This is something of an internal Christian debate, but just so you know why I'm saying what I'm saying, you don't have to agree with me on this, by the way, this is just a view. When the book of Genesis talks about, uses the Hebrew word yom, in the book of Genesis that word can refer to a 24-hour day, but can also refer to a long period of time, in the same way as I might say, in the day of Queen Victoria, I'm not actually referring to a 24 hours, I'm referring to a long period of time when she reigned. And so we definitely have at least one long yom in terms of the 7th day, the day of rest. So I think if it's possible that the Bible can be taken to refer to long days, then it could be that the scientific consensus that says that the universe is 13.7 billion years old is correct, and that life has been around on planet Earth for 3.8 billion years. If that is correct, then it could well be that the dinosaurs lived exactly when paleontologists think they did, and therefore God created them, and then they went extinct. Now, I have to say that I don't know what the purpose of them is. I also don't know why God went to the bother of creating creatures that live in the deepest oceans that existed and could never have been seen by human beings. They came into existence, they lived for long periods of time under the surface of the waters, and they were never seen, and now they're extinct. So I don't know what God's purpose was in that. Why aren't they mentioned in the Bible? I personally think that the Bible is referring, when we get in past Genesis chapter 11 to a relatively recent period of time when, just as today, you don't have dinosaurs around. That's my own personal view. However, I have never even spoken to the leaders of New Life Church Milton Keynes, so I have no idea what view they take. But I personally believe that the universe is old, that the earth is old, and the dinosaurs were extinct long before human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, started walking around on the surface of our planet. Tim, I'll leave the microphone work to you. You go.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jurassic Park 1 was great. 2 and 3 were rugby, and
I was going to say, you're talking about all of the DNA and basically the biology of the DNA. Where do you stand with the idea of God's Hebrew code within the DNA and genome sequencing? Have you heard about that?
Well, I'm going to take a pass because I'm not sure that the average person in Milton Keynes that doesn't know Jesus would ask that question. I don't think that's their issue. I'm really sorry, but I'm going to keep it, if I may, to questions that someone who doesn't know Jesus would ask.
yeah, I think the next, and then I'll over this side. Let's see what happens next.
In relation to salvation, someone might ask, what about people who lived in the remote parts of the world and they've never heard of Jesus Christ? What happens to them? If they die, are they going to go to heaven or not because they've never heard of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, great question. What about those who haven't heard the gospel? And it's quite interesting that there isn't actually any one verse in the Bible that specifically addresses that question. So we've got to kind of piece it together from the bits that we can be clear about. So we're clear that there's this huge emphasis that we should go and tell people the good news. And so that's really important. We also have verses that really encourage us to believe that God is going to be fair. So there's like rhetorical questions in the Bible, in the Old Testament, like, will not the judge of all the earth do right? The answer presumably being, yes, he will. So God is going to deal justly with everybody. That would lead me to suggest that, or lead me to think that God isn't going to treat anybody more harshly than they deserve. Now, all the details beyond that, I think we've got to try and piece it together, and I'm not quite sure what's correct and what isn't. I do know that there are certainly stories from the Muslim world. These are in countries where it would be very, very difficult, close to impossible, to meet a Christian or discover a Bible. You get stories where it seems that there are people who've never met a Christian and never read a Bible, who, for example, have dreams. So I've got books at home of these stories, where somebody, I'll just give you one example this is just one example of a dream story from the Muslim world. Somebody's at home and they have a dream, and in the dream they're driving to a particular petrol station. It's quite a long way out of the city. In the dream, they go to fill up their car with petrol, and somebody comes out to meet them, and that's all they've got in the dream. So this person then thinks, well, it was so specific, it was kind of weird. So they get in their car, they drive there, and exactly this happens. The person in the dream comes in real life, and that person hands them a Bible. So to put that story into your question, could it be that when people respond to the revelation they have received, that God sends them more revelation, and then eventually they do get the content of the Christian faith, and they do respond, and they do eventually hear the good news about Jesus. So that certainly happens in Iran, where there are quite a large number of evangelical Christians in a country where it's illegal to be a Christian, share the gospel, distribute Bibles, and so on and so forth. So that sort of thing is going on. Also, this isn't quite your question, but we have got good reasons to think that children who die young, that they will be in heaven. Jesus says, let the little children come to me. The kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. We get incidents like King David, who's fasting and praying about his son, his child that he had with Bathsheba. He's all that Tiz was about, praying like man his child will survive. Then the child dies, but rather than being distraught, his reaction, he actually says, he gives the impression of what he says next, that he's going to see that child again. So I think there are reasons to think that children who die before what some theologians call the age of responsibility, that they will be in heaven. Beyond that, I think I would be cautious in terms of a definitive answer, but I think that this is the way I process it emotionally. Let's imagine that I have a friend and I just don't know what he thinks about this particular subject. If this friend has proven faithful and reliable and trustworthy in this, and this, that leads me to trust them to make the right call on this thing that I don't know about, based on everything else I know about them. And so even though I don't know what they're going to do about this one thing, there are so many other reasons to think that they're trustworthy that I'm prepared to go with it. And that's how I process it. But if you were to just read the New Testament from start to finish, the overwhelming impression is that we have to go to the end of the earth and share the gospel with these people. And it's definitely not, they're probably okay, let's just keep it as it is. Let's just keep Christianity in Jerusalem. I reckon they'll probably be okay. That's not the feel you get. The feel is we've got to go. I would say that's my understanding. It's a great question. Tim, on you go.
Thank you. This question is about suffering. I have a friend who's a Christian and made a comment that, I'm suffering from cancer because God allowed cancer that I have cancer, so that it draw me closer to Him and also is testing my faith. So what is your opinion about that?
Okay, I'll answer briefly because I think this is maybe a question that's more often asked by Christians than by people who aren't Christians. People who aren't Christians tend not to wonder, is it the case that I've got cancer because there's a God who's trying to draw me closer? Maybe that is the case in this, but that tends to be more thing Christians ask. There's nothing in the Bible, in my understanding, to suggest that God sends sickness because He wants that person to come closer to Him. However, confusingly enough, that is almost always what happens to Christians, that when you are actually off work and at home, you're not doing your job, and you're all of a sudden at home, you're much more likely to pick up your Bible than if you were at work. When you're not being paid to read your Bible, when you're at home, you can't do anything else. Well, you get out your Christian book, you listen to your Christian music, and you probably do become closer to God. But I can't see verses that tell me that God sends sickness. I don't see sanctification through sicknesses. I don't see Jesus telling people it would be good for you to remain sick because God wants to teach you a lesson. He can't do it any other way other than by making you sick and keeping you sick. I don't see Jesus saying that to people. I'm not saying that that's never the case. I mean, what do I know? But that's not the impression you get when you see Jesus' ministry. That doesn't seem to be the heart of God in the New Testament. Great question. Tim, I'll stay with you.
Sorry, mate. Adrian, someone who knows the Bible, back to the dinosaur question, okay? If the wages of sin is death, and we know sin came into the earth, why did the dinosaurs die out before that?
Okay, if it's someone who knows the Bible, I would then go to the book of Romans and I would try and build a case that that's referring not to animal death, but to human death. That would be my personal go-to. I have to say, in all my time sharing the good news with Jesus with people that don't believe in Him, no one has ever done that. So that's not something that's come up in evangelism yet in my time. But that's what I try and do. Oh, loads of questions. Fantastic.
1, 2.
Thank you very much, Adrian. As a Christian, the goal of every Christian is to make heaven. But someone said one day, I think I was listening to a message, that God does not reside in heaven. Because in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So where was God living before creating heaven and the earth?
Where was God living before He created heaven and earth? I think in my answer, when I was talking about science, I was suggesting that the beginning moment, Genesis 1:1, was the beginning of space, time, matter, and energy. So therefore, the cause of the universe is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. Therefore, God does not live in space-time. So whatever heaven is, it's not something that we could conceive of in space-time. However, as I'm sure you know in the book of Revelation, We get quite a lot of information about the final state, where the earth is renewed, the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven, it's joined to the renewed earth, and we can travel from one to the other without telling the difference. So we do know quite a lot about that state, but I think we should think about God's existence, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, as being outside of a space-time universe or a space-time paradigm before the creation of the universe. It's kind of a mind-bending question. Yes, go for it.
Sorry. Hopefully this is a little bit more straightforward, but how do you deal with someone who's lost someone that they love, who is no faith or seemingly have no faith, and for them to come to faith opens up the possibility that they may not see them in heaven when they believe that they're in heaven. That kind of scenario, I think you know what I'm saying in terms of how people react to the gospel. Well, that would mean that I'm not going to see my mum, my daughter, whatever, again.
Yeah.
And that's a genuine block to the gospel.
Yeah, I can say what I have done in that situation. Certainly one person who I said, nobody knows what happens, even in a car crash, in those final moments. Nobody knows. I mean, I don't know what the circumstances are, but if it's somebody who actually is aware that death could be coming, you would have to think to yourself purely on a logical basis, if you know that death is immediate or coming your way, then you might well try and make your peace with God in that moment, even if you're not entirely sure whether God exists, because presumably there's no downside to that at that point. But my point is, in speaking to this person, we don't know. So therefore, it's not just that, hey, it's not for me to judge, which it actually isn't for me to judge, but also, just factually, we don't actually know. So if this person was absolutely adamant, oh, well, that means that my mum's gone to hell, I'd say, well, I don't really see how factually you could be so certain of that, because you just don't know what happened in those final moments. So that's at least opening up the question, who knows? Also, I think we'd have to say, look, the real problem you've got here is that something unfair and unjust has happened. So if God does exist, I mean, if God doesn't exist, then there's no point talking about it any further, because actually your loved one isn't in hell, they're just nowhere. But if God does exist, then we have to look at the character of God. And what do we know about the character of God? Try and build a positive case that actually something unfair hasn't happened, that if whatever has happened is fair and is right and is just. One other thing that I've said to people, and this may well be not true of the person you're talking about, but this is definitely true of a friend of mine called Tom. For many years, I played five-a-side football with a friend of mine called Tom, and he is definitely somebody who, if he were to be railroaded against his will to spend eternity with the Christian God, he would regard that as outrageous. He would regard God as an eternal kidnapper who was basically forcing Tom to be with him when Tom has made really clear that he does not want to be with the Christian God forever. So, could it be that God actually, as C.S. Lewis says, does respect people's choices? And the thing that we're all concerned about is that something unfair has happened. Well, I think kidnapping is unfair. I think God forcing people to be with him who didn't want to be with him is unfair, is immoral, is unjust. And I wouldn't want to worship a God who kidnaps people. Question.
I think we'll probably maybe take 3 more. So 1, 2, 3, and then we're done. Is that okay?
I went to Birmingham New Street last Saturday to evangelize with a group of people, and I encountered a lot of Muslims that asked the question of the Bible. The Quran is written in Arabic, so it's the same version, but the Bible has many versions. So how can you prove that the word of God hasn't been, as in the word hasn't been lost in translations? And another question they asked was, how can you prove that Jesus Christ was crucified? Because in the Quran, it's is in hiding as a prophet. But how can you prove as a Christian that Jesus was crucified?
Okay, two very good questions from a Muslim perspective. The second one is really straightforward. We have 4 sources outside the Bible that all say that Jesus was crucified. So if you want to come up to me at the end, I'll point you to them. But I think from memory there will be Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian of Samosata, and Pliny the Elder. Oh no, the Jewish Babylonian Talmud. They all say 5 sources that all say Jesus was crucified. So the issue with that second question is not that there's a conflict between the Bible's version of events, that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, and the Quran's version of events, that he wasn't. The issue is that the Quran is a source written nearly 700 years after the crucifixion that is contradicting non-Christian, non-biblical, in fact anti-Christian sources written hundreds of years earlier, much closer to the events that say that Jesus was crucified. So that, to me, I'm not saying it's a straightforward conversation with a Muslim, but in terms of a historian, there is no professor of history in any university anywhere in the world who is saying that Jesus was never crucified. The main thing we know about Jesus of Nazareth is that he was crucified. That's like the most well-established point of his life. There's quite a few other things that we can learn from these extra biblical sources, but the crucifixion will be will be the most secure bit. So that's that. Second thing is a kind of a misunderstanding. You've got 2 different claims of inspiration. You've got literal dictation, which is the Muslim view of inspiration, where you've got a copy of the Quran in heaven and a copy on earth, and they're identical. Christians aren't claiming that. So it's like comparing apples and pears. You know, an apple isn't even trying to be a pear isn't even trying to be an apple. If the question is, how do we know that when you open a Bible today that is an accurate translation of the original documents? Well, what scholars are doing today is going around the world and taking high-resolution photographs of the earliest documents that we have for the Old and the New Testament, and then you can translate it yourself. I mean, if there was a Muslim who was really concerned about this issue, it would take them approximately 3 years to learn New Testament Greek, and then they could translate it for themselves. They wouldn't have to rely upon any other translator or anyone else or anybody who might be biased. You can just you can probably find them online now, but you can look at the earliest copies that we have, and you can then translate them. Now, if the question is about the transmission from the original documents, the autographs, as theologians call them, to the earliest documents that we have, there are other reasons why we can be confident that the earliest copy we have is an accurate copy of the original, and that is because if there had been mistakes, miscopying, either deliberate or accidental errors happening, then because we have so many documents, we've got 5,868 New Testament documents, they would all be saying all different things that people have been miscopying. If you were to go to all of those 5,868 copies and put them all next to each other, and they're all more or less saying the same thing, you've just found out that whoever's been doing the copying has been copying accurately, because if there have been some difficulties, they'd all be saying different things. If they're all saying more or less the same thing, then you know that you've got an accurate copy of the original. That's exactly our situation. So ironically, it's the opposite way round. We have such an embarrassment of riches. We have so many copies, so many more copies than we need, so many more copies than any other ancient document, that the case for the reliable transmission of the New Testament documents is actually overwhelming. When we can be sure that what we've got today is an accurate record of what's originally written. Yes, Tim.
Okay. I just had 1 or 2 comments with regards to the dinosaur thing. So in the book of Job, it talks about an animal, the behemoth, and also the leviathan, and its tail's as big as a cedar, which is obviously bigger than any elephant's tail or rhinoceros's tail. So maybe there's an allusion to what we commonly know as a dinosaur there. Also, when we look at cultures all around the world, they all have dinosaur myths, dinosaur understandings of ancient China. All around the world, everybody's conscious of what a dragon is. Sorry, that's the term I meant to use. But in terms of questions for you, what do you say to people who say, how do you know that Christianity is the only way to God? And there aren't just, all these other religions, aren't just other ways to God, if he does exist?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's definitely one that I get asked, I'm sure you get asked. And I think I want to build a kind of a modest case, kind of building step on step on step. So, personally, I would start off with 3 reasons why I think God exists, to establish that. So my first 3 reasons would be evidence from the origin of the universe, evidence from the fine-tuning of the universe, and then moral law, which we didn't have time to get into, evidence from the existence of objective moral values and duties. So those 3 are 3 arguments or reasons I give to think that God exists. Then I would go in on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So this is how I'd answer the question. So I would present the case. Here are some reasons why I think Jesus of Nazareth was a historical person who died by crucifixion. And here are all sorts of reasons, all kinds of lines of evidence why I think he physically rose from the dead. Now, if Jesus really did claim to be the Son of God, and he said that he would vindicate his supernatural claims by physically rising from the dead, if we then have good evidence to think that he did rise from the dead, that is then quite a strong truth claim for what Jesus said about himself. In other words, when Jesus says something like, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father but by me. Well, I can say that, but you'd want to know, okay, well, you're 55, you live in Surrey, you've got 4 kids. Like, give me some reasons why I believe that you're the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the Father but I don't have any reasons. But if actually, my expert Roman executioners, and I predicted publicly before my death that I vindicate my supernatural claim to be the Son of God by 3 days after my death rising, you would then take my supernatural claim a lot more seriously if I come up to you in the street and say, well, hi. You think, wow, this is the guy who said that he'd come back from the dead. So that's how I build the case. I present the evidence for the historical resurrection of Jesus, and by building that historical case, I think that lends credibility to Jesus' exclusive claims. And there were many of them, not just the one that I mentioned. There are many parables, many things he said where he was presenting himself as the unique Son of God, the way to the Father, and the one who would provide forgiveness of sins. So that's how I do it, in a nutshell. Great question.
Cool. I think I've just talked to George, and just maybe he could do a personal question for you at the end, maybe the only one, because I know you've got a long drive to do. I've just got one question for you, for everyone. If people want to go further with any of this stuff, where would you point them?
Okay, I'm going to recommend just one book, because I think it's a lot easier than writing down loads of books, and it's actually quite easy to remember. It's called On Guard. Think about a fencer, yeah? In the Olympics, a fencer, on guard! And it's by William Lane Craig. And that book not only covers all of the questions that we've talked about this evening, but does so in a training way, and does so, actually, the unique thing about this book is it actually has role-play conversations. Like, you say this, the most likely thing they'll say is that. If you say this, the most likely response is that. It's a very readable, accessible book. It's available, I looked on all 4 formats, whether you're a Kindle user, whether you're an audio book. Don't ask me to read books, but I can put my earphones in when I'm driving to work. It's on audiobooks. On Guard by William Lane Craig. That's my recommendation.